We're here with special Magen David presentation, member-to-member presentation by Stanley. Just a couple of ground rules for tonight. We'll hold the questions until the end. At that point, we'll please, if you do have a question, please place it in the chat, and then we'll read them back at the end to Stanley, and Stanley will answer them at that point. I think I'm going to let Stanley introduce himself and tell you about his. He worked for the very senior positions with United Kingdom government, with the Defense Ministry, and he was with the British Embassy here in the early 1980s. And maybe I think you should tell him a little bit about that. I'm going to turn it completely over to Stanley here and put it in, so you won't see too much of me, but you'll see Stanley just right now. Here you go.
Well, good evening, and thank you, whoever switched on. I'm told, believe it or not, that I have a great-grandson who lives in Arizona who is listening tonight. So, hello, JJ. You have joined a lot of other people. I'm supposed to be talking this evening about the Falklands War. I don't really want to talk a lot about the war itself, but to lift the curtain and give you all a glimpse of what goes on when national and international events are in the offing. And I was fortunate enough to be in a position to have some very personal views on this because of the Falklands War, as I'll explain. If we go on to the first slide, Harry, thank you very much. This tells you something about the Falkland Isles, and you now know far more about it if you read that than I knew when I was asked to take a central role. It's about 8,000 miles away from Europe and the UK. It's been settled on and off since the 1600s, as you can see. It's had French, British, Spanish, and Argentinian nationals. It remained a disputed territory until 1840. It then became a British Crown colony, mainly because it was settled by a lot of Scottish nationals. Now, interestingly, during the 1900s, efforts were made by the UK to transfer sovereignty to, of all places, Argentina. This was very strongly resisted by the Falklands residents, who did not want to become residents of Argentine. So there were a couple of referendums, and each time it was strongly resisted. Now, the Falklands War started because in April 1982, Argentine forces occupied the islands. So Britain was then in the very odd situation of fighting to retrieve what were basically unwanted islands. They'd never considered that they wanted to hold on to these, but it was a very different situation of having a diplomatic solution and having something imposed by Argentina. Can we have the next one, Harry, please? Now, just to go over quickly what the Falklands War actually transpired into, and then I will explain why I want to go into the background of all this. The Argentine invaded on the 2nd of April, and Britain immediately appealed to the UN Security Council. And there was a resolution on the 3rd of April that Argentina must withdraw. Interestingly enough, Russia and China did not object to that resolution. In fact, I think Russia voted for it. Now, what it did by having that resolution, and it was resisted by Argentina, it led to the opening of hostilities. Britain officially dispatched a naval force within 1 week. And I say officially, as I'll explain later, it was all a bit of show. The actual conflict lasted only 74 days and the Argentine junta surrendered. A lot of lives were lost. The Argentines lost nearly 650 people. The British lost a lot of people, 250. 3 islanders were killed during the actual fighting on the island. Britain lost 4 ships, 2 destroyers, 2 frigates, and a container ship, 24 helicopters, and 10 fighter aircraft. Not a lot for an enormous war, but a lot of stuff to lose. Falklands also recorded significant losses. So this was a skirmish, really, rather than a major war, but for Britain and Argentina, it was very significant. Next one, please, Harry. Now, this doesn't show up too clearly, but what is important is the distances that were involved. As we said, the Argentine were away in the South Atlantic, 8,000 miles away. Thank you, Harry. You brought it up more closely because you show something very important there, the Ascension Islands. They turned out to be critical because, as I'll explain later, we had that as a basing operation where the forces coming down from Europe could pick up equipment and then take it on. The Ascension Islands are roughly halfway between the two situations. Next one, please, Harry. Next slide, please. Sorry. No, the next slide. Thank you. All right. Why do I possess personal views about this? In March 1982, I was appointed the Minister for Defence in the British Embassy in Washington. In that position, I became responsible for all US-UK defence exchanges. It was an unusual position in the sense that the Defence Department, which I headed, was the biggest department in the British Embassy in Washington, bigger than the State Department or the Foreign Secretary's group, and the commercial and the World Bank, the financial people. So it was the biggest one. Now, anyone might say, well, how did you, Stanley Orman, get such a position? Prior to that, for 6 years, I had been helping to manage, ended up completely managing a program to develop Britain's successor nuclear deterrent. So I joined that program as a director responsible for all the research and development being done to make this system. I then moved from Aldermaston, where the work had started, up into the Ministry of Defence headquarters as the Deputy Chief Engineer, and I finished the program as the Chief Engineer. And when that program finished, my responsibility was then to sign off all the documentation to put a new nuclear weapon into service. And it was just after I'd fired the final approval trials for that system that I was asked to come to the embassy in charge of all US-UK defence exchanges. Now, prior to that, I had been on this other program and was very used to working in the US and the UK. The program had at that time about 10,000 staff, 5,000 in the US, 5,000 in the UK, some in defence companies, some working for the American government, some working for the British government. So I was used to working with very senior military officials, very senior ministers. Coming across to the embassy now was a change of venue, but otherwise nothing unusual. When I was asked to take that position, I asked for a full discussion with the UK State Department officials as to what was ongoing, what was likely to be coming up. Interestingly, 3 weeks before Falklands, Falklands was never mentioned during these discussions. And I was getting the sort of briefing that would go to the Prime Minister or the Cabinet from intelligence authorities. No mention whatsoever. A month later, war was declared, as I mentioned earlier, and I was named the point man to seek American support. This was done on a very close cooperation between the British Prime Minister and the American President, that happened to be President Reagan. He named Weinberger as the individual. Weinberger named one man to work with me. And I met this individual in the Pentagon. Very interesting. Neither of us knew the other one. We had to establish a very quick relationship, and I'll go into the details later of how we did that. Next slide, please. I'm going to introduce the principal characters that played such a role. Obviously, Margaret Thatcher was the British Prime Minister. Lord Peter Carandon was the British Foreign Secretary at the time the Falklands invaded. He withdrew from the position, and I'll go into details about that in a minute, was succeeded by Francis Pym. When I came out to the embassy, Sir Nicholas Henderson was the ambassador in Washington. Sir Anthony Parsons was the British ambassador to the UN. General Alexander Haig was the American Secretary of State. Prior to that, he'd been Sakur, that was the general in charge of all the European forces at that time opposing the Soviet Union. Casper Weinberger is a name familiar to most Americans. He was the American Secretary of Defense. Sir Frank Cooper was the permanent secretary in the British MOD, and Dov Zakheim was the American official appointed by Weinberger to interact with me. By way of explanation, I should say the British civil service is somewhat different to the American, and every British Department of State has a permanent secretary who interfaces with the Secretary of State who's in the cabinet. To leave any doubt about who's really in charge, the Perm Sec in the British civil service actually gets paid slightly more than the cabinet minister who heads the department. So Sir Frank Cooper was a very influential man. And if any of you have ever watched the program Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, you understand the position of a Perm Sec who virtually controls the Prime Minister, the Minister. I remember saying to Sir Frank well after this, were you a yes minister or a no minister, Perm Sec? And his response was, I was a perhaps minister. The next slide, please. All right. The Prime Minister played a vital role in this situation. I had the ability to talk to several members who attended the cabinet meetings throughout this period. Because although I was based in Washington, because I was also making the approval documentation for the next British deterrent, believe it or not, I was doing 2 weeks in Washington and 2 weeks in London to complete this other task. So I was going backwards and forwards, and I had the opportunity to talk to all the characters that I listed on that previous thing, many of whom were attending the cabinet meeting. They made it very clear to me that if the Prime Minister had not been Margaret Thatcher, there probably would have been a much longer period before there was an actual fighting war, and there may not have been a fighting war. Margaret Thatcher was a very determined character who was not fighting because this was a British protectorate, but she, as PM, had given the Falkland Islanders a promise that it would remain under British control. So for her, this was a matter of absolute principle. She was stymied by the loss of Carandon, and I'll explain that one in a minute, because Carandon was one of the few in the cabinet who really wasn't dependent on the Prime Minister. He was a very eminent member of the House of Lords. He wasn't dependent on being in the cabinet, and he was a man of total honor. And he said, I'm sorry, I gave wrong advice to the cabinet. He had told the cabinet that Falklands would not be invaded by Argentina, and he insisted on resigning. And there's more about that later. So the really strong member of the cabinet who could have contained Margaret Thatcher was not there. She called the cabinet meeting and included the 4 chiefs of staff and demanded plans for action. The information I'm giving you was given to me by 2 of the chiefs of staff who said they couldn't give her plans for immediate action because they didn't have anything ready, wasn't expected. The Prime Minister said she would adjourn the meeting and reconvene in the morning. She made it clear to the chiefs of staff they had 2 alternatives. They came back with plans for immediate action, or they handed in their resignations. The first ship left within a week. There was tremendous display in the UK. Marine bands played. The ship, people marched on board. The ship left. There was nothing there. It was pure show. But the Prime Minister had laid down a marker. We were going to retake the islands. The Prime Minister stayed fully engaged throughout the war, controlling all the cabinet meetings. Next one. Lord Carandon, very impressive man who I fortunately got to know quite well. He later became the British Minister of Defence. The Prime Minister begged him to stay, but he refused. He said he couldn't because he had given bad advice to the cabinet. Now, General Haig, who was the American Secretary of State, called the British ambassador and he said, you've got to explain to me why the Prime Minister fired Carandon. And the Henderson explained that no, she hadn't. She didn't want him to go, but Carandon, being a man of honor, said he had to go. Haig couldn't accept the concept that someone had resigned under those circumstances. And he begged the ambassador, he said, look, I've got to explain it to the president. President Reagan wants me to explain to him why he's gone. We've all read the stories that he resigned, but I can't go in and take that. The president wouldn't accept it. He phoned the ambassador several times, and even phoned the ambassador's wife. And the ambassador's wife told me about this later, because it was so unacceptable to think that someone had resigned because he'd given bad information. Pym was appointed the Foreign Secretary in his place, and in my opinion, a diplomatic downward spiral commenced at that point. Next slide, please. As I put up at the beginning and explained, the situation had gone to the UN. We put a successful plea in. The UN had declared Argentina were out of order and had to withdraw. The new Foreign Secretary was, of course, in totally over his head. He tried issuing instructions to the US and to the UK ambassadors. He also tried to influence Haig, who was operating a shuttle diplomacy between America and Argentina. Haig was acting as a good agent, independent, trying to sort things out. The signals back and forth were a delight to read. Because of my position, I was copied on all of these. And the new Foreign Secretary was trying to issue instructions to our ambassador at the UN and to our ambassador in the US, but they had the situation in hand and unfortunately were trying to resist signals which said, you are instructed, and in the most beautiful diplomatic language, they were writing back about, we understand your instructions, but because of some unfortunate circumstances, we are unable, etc., etc. As I said, for a nosy Parker, these were the most marvelous signals to come into the office each morning to read. Next one, please. All work was being done at the UN. The ambassadors were at the forefront. Because of the disagreement with Pym, they were both commanded to go back to discuss this with the Prime Minister. At the time, they flew back on Concorde and came back the next day on Concorde. And Henderson called me to his office to tell me what the situation was. And I said to him, it's extremely kind of you. I mean, you've just come back from a transatlantic trip. And he said, Stanley, it's a pleasure to talk to you rather than being shouted at for several hours by the Prime Minister. But what came back was we had to ensure strong support from the US. And for that, I was dependent on my contact, Dov Zakheim, who I'll talk about later. And I had discussions, obviously, with the ambassadors and with General Haig. Next slide, please. Haig was a remarkable man, absolutely charming, very able. As I said, his one problem was he couldn't understand why his opposite number, Lord Carandon, had resigned. It was a different outlook entirely. And I think perhaps because I had grown up at a time when everyone was told a British gentleman's word is his honor. You cannot go back on your word. And Carandon had stated very clearly that Falklands wouldn't be invaded. And he said, I cannot stay as a Secretary of State because I gave wrong advice. General Haig worked his backside off, literally, flying backwards and forwards from the States to the Falklands, trying to get a diplomatic solution. He was able to keep communications open throughout the war, but he wasn't able to prevent fighting occurring. Next one, please. Thanks. Casper Weinberger played a very central role. He was the one who agreed to provide, under President Reagan's advice, significant support to Britain. Now, the way this worked was, I was informed by Britain what was needed. It was both equipment, it was both support from overhead assets. There was significant amount of equipment needed. I used to negotiate this with Dov Zakheim. Dov's reports went straight to Weinberger, and all instructions were issued by Casper Weinberger himself. As a result, the US provided a lot of frontline equipment. They relocated overhead assets, so we had real-time information on exactly what was happening. The support Britain received was considerable, and all this time, Haig was still being an honest broker and going backwards and forwards, trying to resolve things. Now, a lot of what we got could be attributed to the fact that it was NATO and NATO assets. But people may remember France was also a member of NATO. France was supplying Argentine with Exocet missiles, which they used to attack the ships, and in fact sank, as you saw, 4 of the British ships with material supplied by France. As a result of the enormous help that we got from the Americans, Casper Weinberger was later given an honorary knighthood by the Queen. And I remember shortly afterwards at a meeting, I said to him, I should now call you Sir Casper. And he said, not in America, definitely not in America. Next slide, please. I explained Sir Frank Cooper as was the permanent sec. He collected from all the UK organisations the material and equipment which they needed. He related that to me, and then I provided these requirements to Dov Zakheim. Now, it was so tightly controlled that I was getting the information directly from Sir Frank Cooper. Dov was transferring this directly to Weinberger. So there were very few people in the loop. The procedures meant there were no leaks from Washington. And I was to realize afterwards, during my time here as the minister in the embassy, that a secret in Washington, a really closely kept secret, meant no other people didn't know it for 3 days. The fact that this was kept totally controlled throughout the war was a remarkable achievement. Next slide, please. Right, Dov Zakheim. We forged a wonderful working relationship because I started to chat with him on the first meeting to try and find some background. And what I found was that Dov had got his DPhil at Oxford, and we lived not that far from Oxford. He had married a British girl who had grown up within a few miles from where Helen and I grew up. And we formed a relationship that I later went to many of his family functions, and they came to ours. We both had experience of arranging international cooperation, which was very important. We understood what we could do with our own organizations, but we also understood the limitations of doing something internationally. So I was able to provide him with precise needs, but he then had to work out ways of satisfying those requirements. Now, I mentioned the islands in between, Ascension Island. What we did between us, we had established at Ascension Island a facility where America delivered all the equipment which they were providing to us. They had it in a bonded warehouse, and they issued it to us as and when we required it from Ascension Island. All the instructions for doing this were issued by Weinberger. It was a true allied cooperation, extremely tightly controlled and extremely efficiently produced. Next slide, please. At the end of the Falklands War, I hosted at the British Embassy a reception for the US personnel who'd helped so much. We must have had well over 100 US officials at that party. By then, the British ambassador had left, and we had a new ambassador, Sir Oliver Wright. He was, incidentally, the best boss I ever had throughout my career in the British Civil Service. If we were having a meeting one-on-one with a senator, or if we were addressing a group of 700 or more people, in every situation, I had to admit he was doing it better than I could myself. He was a remarkable individual. And I remember saying to him during that party, this is incredible. The Prime Minister had fought this through on her own. She was now going to be stronger than ever and in total control. He disagreed with me. He said, Stanley, for Margaret Thatcher, this is the beginning of the end. And he used the expression, which a lot of people know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said, she will not listen to advice. He was farsighted and he was correct. She spiraled down, and as you all know, within a few years, she had to relinquish the prime ministership because she would not take advice again from the cabinet and was trying to rule everything. So these were my thoughts at the peek behind the curtain, that things are not all they seem to be at the front, But without American help, we would never have been successful in the Falklands. But we bonded, and once again, that special relationship that has existed for a long time has been maintained throughout. And I hope it's going to continue into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to see what's in the chat, see if there's any questions. Actually, we don't have any direct questions in the chat. I have one question for Stanley. You mentioned that the war conflict was 74 days. Was that including diplomatic dispute, or was that fully military?
No, because it was all military.
It was all military for 74 days.
Although there was a significant gap while there was attempts at the diplomatic, but because that first ship left within a week, officially that was the war starting.
Okay, we do have a question that was brought in. What is the current status of the Falklands?
It's still a British protectorate because the islanders were obviously not happy before and certainly not happy now when there was an attempt to take them over by force.
Yeah. I believe there was a couple of years ago, there was another vote to stay within.
That's right. Yes,
to stay within the
right.
British Isles.
Yes.
Does anybody have any other questions for Stanley? You know, we can go off chat if you want to ask them directly.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Anna Romani. You haven't actually mentioned, Stanley, any efforts to reach out to the Argentines, or meetings with Argentine officials in Washington or through the embassy in Buenos Aires, for example. Was that going on?
That was you mean at the time?
Yes.
No. Haig was doing his shuttle diplomacy, and my task was purely and simply to identify from the UK what equipment was needed, and then to relay this to the US and find a way of meeting those requirements.
Right, but do you know if the British government and the Americans were actually actively trying to reach out to the Argentines and dissuade them, or the bigger picture?
That was what Haig was trying to do the whole time, even during the war.
Right.
Yes, he was a remarkable man, very affable man. The sort that if you got him to sit down and talk, could regale you with wonderful stories, having been the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. But there was no way, because the Argentine junta would not back down at all.
So there's another question that came in. It says the ship that was for show, the first ship out, how did the US or UK make it look real?
As I said, with bands playing, people marching on. And of course, once it got out of sight, they all came off again because there was nothing there. But the impression was that this was the first start. The only thing they could get out there quickly was submarines, and they got those out quickly. These were not the nuclear attack submarines, and the ones that I had been working on. These were the killer submarines to keep the Argentine forces in port. And in fact, they did sink the Belgrano, which was an Argentine vessel that came out, and the British submarine sank it.
So there was actually follow-on to that same question.
Yes.
I think the gentleman who asked the question said it was actually what was done. What did the Argentines see at the other end when the ship got down? Where did the ship,
Oh, well, that ship, I don't remember whether that ship
actually went. It went there.
I honestly don't remember.
Maybe it didn't
No.
make it to the Falklands. Okay. Let's see. Is there any other questions for Stanley tonight? But we've.
Hey, Stanley.
Yes.
Thank you for the update. It was really good. And what I took home more than anything else is you breaking down each of the individual players and giving an update of where, all the different things. Now, I do remember the stories about him resigning and all that, but I had no clue why he resigned. So it was great about Dov, about all of these guys individually. You went through and gave a little update about each of the players in the whole thing. So thank you. Amazing job.
Yeah, well, to me, that was so interesting to explain the role of these individuals in what was a major world event. And each one played a role and changed the situation somewhat.
Okay.
The only one who wasn't able to was poor Pim, who came in at the last minute and tried to take control, and control had left him.
See, we have a question from Jerry Dancis. If you'd like to ask the question, go ahead. Jerry, do you have a question? Can you, maybe you're on mute, possibly? Jerry, you're still on mute.
Hi. So yes, my question is, did Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher know she would have American military support before she made her decision?
No. What I might add is that she had such a wonderful relationship with Reagan that it could almost be said that she knew it would be forthcoming even before asking. I can explain how close their relationship was when, well after the Falklands now, when George Bush, 41, won the election after Reagan's second term, Reagan sent a note across to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to say, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to establish a relationship with Bush before he succeeds me. And he invited the Prime Minister across to spend a few days talking with him and Bush before officially Bush took over. So this was like in the November or the December after the election and before Bush took on. And I was fully aware of this at the time because the Prime Minister then asked the officials to provide her with material to discuss with Bush. And I had provided materials about the Star Wars program, the SDI program, which by then I was the Director General of British participation in the SDI program, which was Reagan's pet project. And so, but it indicated the close relationship between the Prime Minister and the President, that she was just invited across to the White House to spend 2 or 3 days talking with him and Bush about how things would pan out in the future.
The next question really is, during the Spanish-American, I'm just living, Spanish-American War, the media had a major role in the U.S. is going to war in the Spanish-American War. What was the British media's involvement here?
Well, like most, the left-wing media was very shocked that we were going to war. The right-wing media was supportive of Thatcher's actions, but essentially it was it was all catching up, because once the war started, there was no stopping it. So they were having to report what they could gather about what was happening. And of course, the government was controlling everything because it was 8,000 miles away. Now, they did have one or two reporters embedded with the British troops, and they were reporting back what was happening, but it was very limited compared to what happens these days.
So the next question was, France, obviously you said France was arming Argentina. What was the aftermath of that with the UK government after the war?
No, there were not arguments. I mean, the British and the French are supposed to have what is called the entente cordiale, and it's never been that cordial. There's always friction between the two in one form or another.
So the next question: what are your personal views with respect to about the rightness of trying to hang on to this outpost 8,000 miles away?
But they didn't. That was the anomaly. Britain didn't want to hang on to it, but they didn't want to give it over by force. And there are so many still disputed areas in the world. And Thatcher's comment at the time was, if we allowed this to happen, outbreaks of a similar nature would be occurring all over the world. And she used this as an example of no. And to some extent, you can see the way the Chinese have now totally overtaken agreements with Hong Kong. When Britain handed back Hong Kong to China, it was agreed there would be two situations. There would be the Hong Kong would be allowed to proceed independently, and it did for a number of years, and then China said enough.
So, we have looks like Elias Misery is, Elias, you have a question.
Yes, I do. How are you doing?
Good.
Stan, can you just explain how it was like in the beginning of this talk? You mentioned that there were a bunch of ships and helicopters and 255 people dead from
Yes.
the British side. How that happened when England, being one of the strongest, countries in the world in terms of ships and all that stuff, and in general, as an army, how is that they lost that many ships in the hands of the Argentinians, which, as far as I understand, is not such a great, military power?
No, but Argentine were fighting off their coast, and the Brits were 8,000 miles away. So what was remarkable was they had so few losses compared. And as I explained, the French were providing the Exocet missiles, which were being launched at those ships. And unfortunately, they found that a lot of that ship superstructure was aluminium to keep the weight down. And once it started burning, it burnt very easily. So it led to a redesign of a lot of warships after the war.
So it looks like Steve Goldberg, you got a question? We're happy to.
Yeah, hi. Very good presentation. A little bit of more about Margaret Thatcher, maybe, because she's quite a lady in many ways. Apparently, she did not get off very well with the Queen. They had some issues. And she also had issues with other folks, particularly apartheid in South Africa and so forth. Did you get a sense, if you go broader than Falklands, about how Thatcher was viewed within the British hierarchy? And particularly since you sort of got overthrown a bit in her later years by Michael Hazeltine, I believe.
No, Michael was not.
John Major.
It was, yeah, but she wasn't thrown over by John Major. The British.
Okay, why don't you explain that?
Yeah, the British system is very different. We, like the US, Trump referred to the swamp. But basically, it's a group of people that do have a lot of influence, and they're there regardless of who's in power. The British have their grandees, many of them members of the House of Lords, who particularly have influence with conservative governments. And what happened was Margaret Thatcher was never welcomed by the grandees, but she made her way, and she was a very forceful, very strong character. On a personal basis, I was tasked, when I was running the British end of SDI, I used to have very regular meetings with the American General Abramson, who was her first director of SDI. He was an extremely personable man. And I got a note from the PM to say, next time General Abramson comes across for a meeting, will you please bring him into number 10? And of course I'll bring him into number 10. And I walked across with General Abramson, and the policeman said, yes, thank you, General Abramson. Dr. Orman, you can come back for him at 2 o'clock. And the door was closed in my face. And Margaret Thatcher just took to Abramson. She really thought he was great. So every time he came across, I used to walk across number 10 with Abramson, and each time the door would be closed, and she would tell me send little notes back saying how much she'd enjoyed the meetings. And then I was tasked with advising her what he was going to talk about so she'd be better equipped. And on one of these, after the meeting, she told me I'd got it all wrong. And being Margaret Thatcher, when I used to send notes into the Margaret Thatcher, mine had to be initialed by the Chief of British Defence Staff, by the Defence Secretary, and there was someone else. Anyway, but they both had to initial these, and then it went through to the Prime Minister. She was so annoyed with one of the briefs I provided that she wrote back to me, Dr. Orman, you've got it wrong. And she wrote this back to me with copies to the Chief of Defence Staff and the Defence Secretary. And I wrote back to her and I said, Prime Minister, the General and I were both extrapolating from early data. This has been my speciality throughout my career of deciding what can be done in a certain timescale and what can't. And I stick to my predictions that he cannot do what he says he's going to do in the timescale. And she wrote back and she said, we'll see. Well, of course, it was something that was going to happen in 3 years' time. And 3 years passed. And I remember going into the Defence Secretary and saying, well, I'll write back to the Prime Minister and say, well, who was right? And he said, I wouldn't advise it. But that's an indication of how she viewed things. She was very much her own person. You are quite right, she wasn't accepted by the British the British swamp, if you like, the British group that really controlled things. And at the end, they went to her and said, "Madam, you got to go."
So Harry Abadi has a comment which says he hopes you write another book with all those reminiscences and stories that you have. It's a unique, precious fragment of history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I touch on some of these in my other thing, but it's now so long ago. Yeah, the memory is there, but I don't know how long it's going to last, Harry. But thank you for the thought. I find it remarkable how much of this I retained, because, as I said, on that period, I was literally between March and August flying backwards and forwards, 2 weeks here and 2 weeks in the UK, to sign off the documentation to put that missile into service, which it did go into service and was in for 15 years as Britain's nuclear deterrent. Anyway, thank you all very much. And what my great-grandson made of it, I cannot imagine, but I'm assured he was watching.
But based on the feedback we're getting, it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Does
Absolutely.
anybody have a last question? If not, we thank you very much for this evening, and we'll have further presentations in the future from Morgan V. Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.